Tell us about the focus of your mother's Holocaust writings and what in her life led her in that direction.
The focus of most of her writings is on Christians who risked their lives to save Jews during the war. And I think if you asked her the question, she would probably say that that fascination for her grew out of her own personal experience because, as you know, since you just read her memoir, she and her sister and her mother and father, they were all saved by Christian families who risked their lives to save them. So I think when she started to write the memoir in the late 1970s, it started getting her thinking about that whole issue and what makes people do heroic things. And so that's been her fascination and her passion in all of her work.
Her autobiographical account of that period is titled Dry Tears. What do you think it means?
To me it means, well, also the subtitle is The Story of a Lost Childhood, and I think together Dry Tears and The Story of a Lost Childhood implies that there wasn't time to cry, that you didn't have the luxury of being able to feel sad, that your uncle had just been killed in front of you or what have you. So I think it has to do with the inability to really be a child and to cry and to have the full range of emotions that children have.
Your mother was able to move about in the community during that time, but her parents had to remain hidden. Why, and was that an unusual circumstance in those situations?
In Poland in the 1930s and 40s, Jews, adult Jews, usually in the home, they didn't speak Polish at home, they spoke Yiddish. And so because they spoke Yiddish at home and that was their language that they were most comfortable with, when they would speak Polish, they spoke with a heavy Yiddish accent. It's sort of similar to here in this country how we have the most recent immigrants, like Latino immigrants will often, the older generation will speak English with a Spanish accent or a Mexican accent or a South American accent, but the children will actually completely lose their accent. So, similarly for my mother and her sister, who went to Polish schools and learned Polish from a very young age and had friends in school who were Polish, they spoke Polish all the time and they didn't speak with any kind of accent. Her parents spoke with a little bit of a Jewish accent, so if they had been walking down the street and somebody had said, "Who are you, where are you going?" the minute they answered the question, it would have been obvious that they were Jewish. The other issue for Jews in trying to pass in Poland was that there was a stereotype of what Jews looked like. Dark hair, a big nose, dark eyes, there were that kind of Sephardic Jewish look. And my mother's mother actually did look Jewish, but neither she nor her sister nor her father, they all very much had sort of light hair and blue eyes. And so physically, just purely visually, they all could have probably passed as non-Jewish in Poland at that time. But again, the speaking, the language was the issue for both of her parents.
Did your mother come away from that experience believing that the family who harbored hers did it out of the kindness of their hearts? And how did she process the relationship later? How long was it before she could actually write about her experience?
My mother's experience was unusual in that the family, actually two families that ended up, that saved her family, they did it for money. If you look at all the cases that we know of, that was a very, very, very small minority of the cases. Most of the cases where Christians risked their lives to save Jews, there was no exchange of money. This is probably true because if you think about it, the risk of hiding Jews was death for the entire family. If one person in the family had been hiding Jews in the cellar, the Germans practiced what they called collective responsibility. Everybody attached to the family would be executed on the spot. Actually, there are cases in certain parts of Eastern Europe where the Germans actually extended that to include an entire village. So they would find one family in a village harboring Jews, and they would actually kill the entire village. So it was, it was a very brutal kind of a thing. So because of that, only the only people who really did this were people who really were willing to risk death. For a number of reasons, which actually she gets into in another book, but we're not talking about that book, so. Okay.
How long was it before she could actually write about her experience?
She started, it was in the 70s that she started thinking about it and talking about it first. She actually, they came to the United States in 1950, and for the first 20 years or so, living in New York and then living in Connecticut, she had many close friends who didn't even know anything about her past. They just knew vaguely that she was from Europe, and that was it. And they sort of knew not to ask any questions. And then slowly in the 70s, she started talking about it and then writing about it.
Among the several books she's written on the subject is one called The Lion's Den, which tells the incredible story of a man named Oswald Rufeisen. Can you give us a brief summary of that story and tell us how your mother came to learn of him and other lives she chronicled?
I think she came across him in an archive when she was researching her previous book, which was When Light Pierced the Darkness. But I'm not 100% sure of that. But he is an interesting case because he was a Jew who managed to not only pass as a Christian, but because he spoke impeccable German and Polish, he got a job working as a translator for the German army. So he actually was essentially in the German army, even though he was a Pole and they thought he was a Polish Christian. And he eventually ended up rescuing hundreds of Jews by tipping them off about raids. And he ended up having to flee himself when someone denounced him. But that case, the case of Oswald Rufeisen, was the first time that my mother started to see that the idea of rescuer and rescued as being discrete, separate groups wasn't always so clear, that sometimes the lines were blurred, because Oswald Rufeisen was a Jew, so he was technically hunted by the Germans, and yet at the same time he rescued a lot of people. So that led naturally to the next book, which is Defiance.